Hello, and welcome to this lecture entitled Progressives and the Negro Question. This phrase privileges white power and racial control, but we'll use it because it was common in the era itself, distasteful as it might be to us today. This lecture also will touch only on the high points of racial issues during the Progressive era. They are substantially more complex and even brutal than I'll discuss here. One thing we have to note is an increase in hostility by whites toward blacks after 1870. There was a generation, even two, of whites who did not have close contact with blacks and yet still had power over them. Whites did not have a stable hierarchy over African Americans. One thing that occurred is that many more lynchings happened between 1890 and 1920. Race riots also occurred with relative frequency, and these are not the same kind of race riots that we might think of after the 1960s. No, race riots before the 1960s meant that white people invaded black sections of town and burned them or tried to run everyone out. The first of these was in 1886 in Seattle, Washington. There was a large one in Wilmington, North Carolina in 1898, another in Lake City, North Carolina in 1898, and a third that year in Greenwood County, South Carolina. In 1900, a race riot took place in New Orleans, and another one took place in New York City. Then in 1906, both Atlanta, Georgia, and Brownsville, Texas experienced significant race rioting. In 1908, Springfield, Illinois had a massive race riot. And then on July 4th, 1910, after Jack Johnson, the African-American boxer, won the World Heavyweight Championship, there was nationwide race rioting. Let's look at a graph of lynchings by race in the U.S. South from 1890 to 1910. This is divvied up by race again between blacks and whites, and you can see the number per year beginning with a big spike in 1891 and then slowly reducing, but still being fairly significant, and real significant if it's happening to you. Until 1910, we don't see a drop-off until the 1920s. Blacks and whites were lynched. You can see a substantially larger number of blacks were lynched, and consequently a larger percentage of the population. We've already learned a bit about Jim Crow laws. Jim Crow is the de jure or legal segregation of the races as opposed to de facto or cultural segregation of the races. This was a time in which legalization replaced community mores overall. Tennessee passed the first segregated railcar law in 1881, and it was a Louisiana segregated railcar law that led to the famous Plessy versus Ferguson case before the Supreme Court in 1896. The Supreme Court in Plessy established the so-called separate but equal doctrine that allowed states and localities to pass laws segregating the races in both accommodation and in education. Accommodation segregation was pretty much finished by 1908. Southern states also passed new segregationist laws and constitutions between 1890 and 1908, aimed especially at disfranchisement, that is, taking away voting rights. How did constitutions and laws take away voting rights? By instituting poll taxes, literacy tests, sometimes these came later, white-only primaries instituted by the party. This would be the Democratic Party. And all of these things occurred in large part because of a fear of populism by political elites and by the rising middle class. White supremacy was used to split the populists who were a class-based movement. Progressives feared the old connection between planters and blacks as well. that worked against middle-class interests and enfranchised rural areas rather than urban areas where this middle class tended to live. Progressives also wanted to clean up government and limit it to responsible citizens, a status that did not include poor and working class whites or any blacks at all. The culture and the economy both became dominated by segregationist and white ideology. This reduced the need for black skilled workers over time as they were relegated to labor only. White customers of black businesses dried up, and blacks were relegated to the least preferred occupation, least preferred housing, least preferred accommodations, and they suffered reduced public expenditures on education. Even the federal government segregated facilities and offices that had not been segregated before. This occurred specifically under Woodrow Wilson as president, beginning in 1913. In fact, President Wilson showed the D.W. Griffith movie, Birth of a Nation, at the White House, calling it, quote, writing history with lightning, unquote. Many other people then and now considered it to be extraordinarily racist. There was a black response to Jim Crow. One response was accommodation. Booker T. Washington is best known for this stance. He was the leader of Tuskegee Institute in Alabama, and he promulgated this idea of accommodation in his Atlanta Compromise speech of 1895, in which he emphasized moral and economic improvement that would give blacks civil rights because they made themselves economically significant. Consequently, manual labor, not professional education, was the key to advancement, according to Washington. There was a second response, agitation and a demand for equality. The people that agreed with this, agitation and demanding equality, criticized Washington's speech in 1895 immediately, but then these critics fell into a torpor in the tide of anti-black sentiment that rose to 1900. By 1903, black criticism of Washington was on the rise again. There was also streetcar boycotts because of new segregation laws between 1898 and 1904 in New Orleans, Columbia, South Carolina, Atlanta, Georgia, Mobile, Alabama, Augusta, Georgia, and Houston, Texas. The largest voice in the agitation movement was W.E.B. Du Bois. Du Bois wrote in 1903 in Souls of Black Folks an essay that criticized Washington and promulgated his own idea of the talented 10th, who would be educated as professionals and visionaries and philosophers who would lead the African American race. Du Bois was a founder of the Niagara movement beginning in 1905, and in 1910 joined with white race liberals and brought in the remnants of the Niagara movement into the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, that is the NAACP. This organization, which still exists today, used investigation and the courts to fight racial injustice and segregation. It also used agitation, particularly in its journal, The Crisis, the Record of the Darker Races, edited by Du Bois himself for a number of years. And you can see in the image here the cover of Volume 1, Number 1. Let's look at these fellows right now. You can see to the left is Booker T. Washington, who died in 1915 at the early age of 59, and W.E.B. Du Bois, who died in 1963, just one day before the March on Washington of August 28, 1963. So in summary, for progressives, the so-called Negro question was the culmination of a number of trends. One was that two generations of racial segregation split blacks and whites, taking them out of close contact. Two, was that there was an unstable place for former slaves and their descendants in the white-dominated body politic. This led to number 3, white supremacist ideology and Jim Crow laws, and this all operated in 4, a rapidly changing economy that left this new middle class struggling for dominance. Regardless of class, a majority of white people wanted black people subjugated to their personal as well as their race and their class will. They used vigilante methods to accomplish this, such as rioting and lynching. Politically, African American voters, men, were subjugated to local elites who held them hostage, you might say. Their votes were bought or were manipulated to the consternation of the progressives who wanted to clean up political corruption. In the wake of the frightening politics across the color line of the populists of the 1890s, the remedy to settle politics back down was to disfranchise blacks and many poor whites, which southern states did by law and constitution and practice between 1890 and 1915. African Americans responded, and 2 of the most interesting responses stirred up a fight between Booker T. Washington and W.E.B. Du Bois, both noted intellectuals and race leaders. Washington stressed what has come to be called accommodation, that blacks should make themselves worthy of full citizenship, and Du Bois championed resistance to oppression and agitation, demanding that political authorities give blacks the constitutional rights to which they were entitled. This so-called Negro question lingered into the late 20th century and still is not solved today. This then ends the lecture, and thank you as always for your attention.